Do it live. Hello, everybody. I'm BMillzebub. Welcome back to my channel if you've been here before, or welcome if you're brand new, kind of like my guest here. I do want to apologize for starting so late. I was helping my family pick out a Christmas tree, and, well, I'm pretty much the only person, apparently, who's capable of physically cutting one down. But today, I kind of thought that I would... Hi, Tier. Have a I had an interesting discussion with this guy about a week ago, and I figured that I'd have him on my channel and maybe do a little bit of a repeat of that discussion. So without any further ado, I'm gonna introduce my guest, David Dault. How you doing?
Hello, BMillzebub. I'm glad to be with you today. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, not a problem at all. So, like I told you off stream, I like to have my guests kind of describe who they are, what they do, the relevance they have to making a video on the channel. So I'm going to let you do just that.
Sure. So I am, I guess, what you would call a professional Catholic. I have been employed by various religious institutions through the years as a teacher or as a minister. And we can get into the details of that either in this conversation or a later conversation. I'm currently an assistant professor of Christian spirituality at Loyola University, Chicago. And I also am a religious podcaster, which means I help out organizations producing their podcasts. I do that for a variety of religious organizations, but I also produce a couple of shows of my own, a weekly radio show and podcast called Things Not Seen, which is a sort of hour-long format similar to Fresh Air, where we're talking about culture and faith. And then about 16 times a year, I produce a show with a Franciscan priest and the editor of National Catholic Reporter, a show called The Francis Effect, which is podcast only. I was raised an atheist. I was an atheist for about 18 or 19 years. Then I was a member of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, for about 15 years. And for the last 16, 17 years, I've been Roman Catholic. In a weird hiccup in the middle there, I was also for several years a fill-in pastor at a rural Presbyterian church. So I've got an eclectic background. And I may or may not be typical of the kind of people that you usually have on your show. I don't know if I'm representing anything here other than my own experience, but I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm happy to talk about anything you want to. So I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think you would, in a kind of twisted way, be perfect for a show that I have called Apostate Interviews.
Okay.
I don't know if you can really be an apostate from atheism since it's not a religious thing, but it'd be really interesting to have the experience of someone who started out atheist and then became something else.
Sure. From the little that I know about your own journey, it seems like you and I are kind of on inverse paths here, where I'm the opposite of the journey that you've taken. So I find that fascinating.
Yeah, but what we spoke about a week ago. Hello, Kitty. You can. Okay, she wants to perch there.
All good.
I was gonna put her on the floor, but so last week we spoke about you wanting to call out bad Catholics.
So I'm interested in that phrasing. So I'm not sure what you mean by bad Catholics. The way that I entered into the conversation with you, by my recollection, was you had posted some things about the ways that the church has harmed people, and my response was, whenever I hear that people are vulnerable or people have been harmed, I want to shut up and listen. And so that was kind of my entry point into this, was to just basically be a person to offer to listen to people that had been hurt. But you know, I'm wary of using terms like bad Catholics or good Catholics. I think that there are a lot of my fellow members of the Catholic Church that would look at me and my pedigree or the things that I say and would consider me a bad Catholic or maybe not a Catholic at all. And certainly there are a lot of Christians that would consider me as a Catholic, or again, given the positions that I have, to not be a Christian at all. So I think that those terms are very slippery, and I want to be careful using them.
They are kind of slippery, but when I use it, I'm talking about like the Nick Fuenteses, you know, the people that are like, oh, women's rights shouldn't exist, gay rights shouldn't exist. They call themselves reactionary Catholics and are actually quite racist and anti-Semitic. Because if I don't know if you've listened to anything Nick Fuentes has to say, but he did a show on his whatever a week or two ago, and one of the things he said was that an organized Jewry could be very influential. So anti-Semitic, let's toss that on there too.
And I yes, and I would agree with you that that's reprehensible behavior. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that that puts him outside the pale of Catholicism, since prior to 1965, that was the position of the Catholic Church. So, I mean, it's you know, there's a lot of variables here. But I mean, if you're asking me to condemn Nick Fuentes's position, I absolutely do. But I'm not sure that I can condemn him as being a bad Catholic. I think that I just say that I read the tradition differently than he does.
Yeah, that's fair. So, yeah, I kind of misremembered what our conversation was about then. Then again, it has been weeks since then. I've had a lot of other conversations and, you know, other headaches. I hate doing DoorDash, and right now that's like my main source of income. So I don't know if you've ever done it. If you don't have to, don't.
I've done similar service jobs in the past, and I was a waiter for a number of years in various restaurant situations. So I know a little bit about what you're having to deal with, and having that kind of income stream can be very frustrating sometimes.
Oh yeah. So talking about how people have been hurt by the Catholic Church. You know my story, at least some of it. The potential for what some have coined as religious trauma. I'm wondering, like, you personally, has the church done anything to harm you? I mean, I wouldn't imagine very much so, since you're still at least self-proclaimed Catholic, and I'm sure that your local pastor or bishop hasn't said no communication for that, or no communion for that guy. So in that way, I would assume that you're still practicing Catholic.
I mean, you've just made a gesture into an interesting direction, and I think I might have something that would lock on to what you're saying. So I grew up in South Georgia, and I was an atheist in South Georgia. And so my earliest memories of engaging with religious people was basically again and again and again religious people telling me that I was going to hell. So I went to a new school in fourth grade. The first day I was there on the playground, and I said to a playmate, I don't believe in God. By the end of recess, it was all over the playground. And by the end of the school day, it was all over the school. And for the next 2 years at that school, I would have people on the bus, people cornering me on the hallway to the bathroom, people just stopping me, including teachers, basically saying, you don't believe in God? That's too bad. You're going to hell. You need to get straight with Jesus right now. So for most of my formative years, my experience of religious people was that they were abusive bigots. And so I'm not I did not become a religious person because of the bigots, and I don't stay a religious person because of the bigots. I'm here in spite of the bigots. I had a very different experience personally with Jesus Christ, and with the way in which the gospel speaks to me. And so what animates me oftentimes is something very different and something frankly infuriating to bigots. That's the motor of my particular attempt to be a Christian versus have I been harmed by the church? Yes, as an outsider, also as an insider, because those people still exist. They told me I was going to hell when I was an outsider to the church. When I became an insider to the church, they still exist and they still tell me that I'm doing it wrong and I'm going to hell. So those people still abuse me, but they're not the reason that I came, and they're not the reason that I stay, and they don't represent the Jesus that I'm in love with. So, I mean, in that sense, yeah, that abuse is still there. And I have a very strong inner atheist that looks back at me every day in the mirror when I get up and says, don't be like those people. So that's part of kind of where I am operating from here.
All right. So obviously, I think we can say firmly that your previous treatment by the religious informs the way you treat people who are outside your religion now.
Yeah, absolutely. In the sense that I want to be hospitable to them and understanding of them and caring for them, regardless of whether or not they spout the doctrine that I spout.
Fair. So I want to ask you what brought you into religion, but that's more of a apostate interview thing than discussing.
We can have lots of conversations, so I'm happy to come back in whatever format and basically hit me with any question you want in any order you want, and you will not offend me. And I'm open to owning the bad and to the extent I can, sort of talking about and articulating the good that I see.
All right. So just to let everybody know that this is only going to go on for about another half hour. Unfortunately, David has another engagement to get to. However, we do have that half hour, which is pretty awesome. So kind of turning back to me, since I'm the one that was honestly, the church didn't harm me, and that's why I left. That's not at all it. But while I was still Catholic, I mean, it did harm me. That it's just not why I left. I probably phrased that poorly. But while I was still Catholic, my personality got flipped in all the wrong ways, I think. Excuse me. Here. Stop it. Dog's digging into the litter box. I may have to kennel him. But yeah, so I became actually that guy. I was, my personality at the time was probably that, actually was definitely that of, you're probably going to go to hell if you don't, follow Jesus, and it better be the way I do it, because the way I do it's the right one. I don't know if I ever got quite as aggressive as the people who would you quantify your previous treatment by these bigots as bullying, or?
Yeah, well, so, we were all like 9, 10, 11 years old. And so these were children who had, I guess, observed their parents and observed their pastors and had learned a kind of very kind of gross version of the exclusive behavior that they saw their parents and their pastors doing. And so, yeah, I would say being cornered on a bus or being cornered when I was walking down a hallway by 3 or 4 guys asking me questions, including guys that I had never, met before, but had heard about me in the school, or by, people just kind of casually passing me and saying, I hate you, and things like that. So all of that I would consider to be kind of bullying and abusive behavior. And I was a new kid. I was, my parents had just gotten divorced. I was feeling very out of sorts and very alone. And so, what I would consider to be the hospitality of Christians, or Christian kindness to the stranger, or all the things that are, commanded in, places like Leviticus 19 or Deuteronomy 26, those weren't being practiced on me. The stranger was not welcomed by these people. So yeah, bullying would be a good word for it.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if I would consider the way I behave to be bullying even now, because I was never like in people's faces about it. But I get the feeling that there's a chance some people would disagree with me on that. So I'm keeping an open mind to that. And the way I used to previously treat people, and some of the worst ways I saw other people treat outsiders, informs the way I behave now. So in a weird way, like you don't seem to be one of those bullies, and the way you're talking, you definitely don't behave in that way. So I think that's one part of our journey that doesn't line up as the inverse of the other.
Well, if I
But
may, though, there were points when I was sort of getting to where I am now, after I had become affiliated with Christians, and then I went to graduate school. I went to seminary, and then I went to further graduate school. And there was a window in there where your experience, where you're describing sort of, I've got the right way to do it, and everybody else is wrong, and I'm going to tell you how you were wrong. I definitely went through that phase, and I definitely had a phase where I was a kind of attack dog for a really narrow version of Christianity. And I kind of had my eyes opened and saw what that was doing to my relationships and to the people around me, and I pulled back from it. But I understand the temptation. There's a real strong temptation, particularly for white guys like me of a certain age, to want to be right and to feel very vulnerable if anyone says that we're not. So in that sense, I do have a lot of empathy for the position that you're describing.
okay. So I had a question, but I lost it.
I'm sorry.
I love when that. I think you glitched for a second. Did you say something?
I did not. I saw you glitch too, but I wasn't saying anything. We didn't lose anything other than just me saying I'm sorry that you lost your question.
Yeah. Yeah, StreamYard will glitch sometimes too. So if it does that, we'll just sort of pause for a second and make sure we're on the same page. Damn, it was a good one too. It'll come to me probably after this stream's done. So the role you take in the podcasts you're on, are you like a producer, or are you actually part of the discussion?
So I work on a great number of podcasts every month. I think right now I'm producing 5 or 6. Most of those I'm behind the scenes, but there are 2, the ones I mentioned at the top of the show, Things Not Seen, which is also a radio show, and the Francis Effect podcast. In both of those, I'm both the producer and editor behind the scenes, but I'm also part of the on-air talent. In Things Not Seen, it's a one-on-one interview, and I'm the interviewer. And then in the Francis Effect, I'm part of a panel, and we're discussing like topics from the news from a Catholic perspective.
All right. So would you say that, I don't know if you'd want to consider yourself a moral grounding point, but like if you see one of your co-hosts starting to get out of line, do you kind of pull them back into behaving and be like, hey, this is actually not okay treatment of a group of people or anything like that?
So I'm in the lucky position that there's not strong ideological differences in that way with my co-hosts. We all would be kind of what would be considered on Twitter the left Cath tradition, or the more progressive side of Catholicism. We have definitely disagreements, but they are thankfully not disagreements that arise out of things like the basic decent treatment of other people. We're kind of all morally centered similarly in a tradition that coming out of the tradition from Cardinal Bernardin here in Chicago. It's sometimes called the seamless garment or the consistent ethic of life. That would really be the anchoring tradition and reading of Catholic social teaching that the 3 of us are coming from. And so we've got a basic agreement about human decency. But in and around that, we do have moments where there's friction, but it's a matter where there are definitely so I understand the kind of situation that you're talking about where someone is kind of goes off the range. Most of the time that doesn't happen in the shows I produce because I'm in the lucky position of being able to be very choosy about who I work with. And so in that sense, I'm not often confronted with that in an immediate position. I get a chance to gatekeep that much earlier in the process. So I get pitched guests all the time for my interview show from people that I would consider to be absolutely horrendous morally. And I then have the ability to say to their publicists or to say to them, you're not a good fit for the show. And sometimes I tell them why. But I always try and be irenic even when I do that. I try and not attack the person, but just say, you know, your position is one that I find to be abhorrent. Yeah.
So your behavior is quite Christ-like in that you take the position of how you treat the least of us is how you treat me.
I like the way that you just phrased that. So one of the things that I have come to in my own relationship to Christianity is I don't think that I get to call myself a Christian. And you notice in this conversation, I've been very careful to say I'm attempting to be a Christian. I'm, you know, I sort of became involved with Christian communities. But I think at the end of the day, the people that really get to say whether or not I'm a Christian are the poor and my enemies. And if the poor and my enemies look at Dault and say, yeah, he treated us with love and he treated us with compassion and he was caring and he was Christ-like to us, then they get to say whether or not I was Christian. But I think it's very, very dangerous if someone tries to own that as a kind of badge. I'm a Christian now, therefore I get to do X, Y, and Z. I think that all manner of really horrible behaviors follow from that kind of ownership of that name. So I'm always trying to think exactly as you said, how would the vulnerable, how would a person who doesn't like me interpret what I'm doing right now, right here? And I try and act in a way that would be, and I want to be careful about this because loving doesn't necessarily mean accepting or just rolling over. But even to my enemies, I would like my enemies to feel like I always gave them a fair shake and that I was decent to them, even when I was standing in the way of them harming the vulnerable. I don't know if that helps to answer, but that's kind of where I come from on this.
It kind of does. I really like that position that you take. You know, so it's more of a I try to be Christian.
Yeah, and if you the times when I felt like Christianity was an achievement, and this is more like when I was in that period that I talked about a few minutes ago, I kind of described that as my virtue fascism period, where I was like, I have the right answer, and it is my obligation to impose the right answer on you, even if you don't think that it's the right answer. Like at that particular moment, that's a really horrible thing to combine with thinking that you're a Christian, because then you don't just have the kind of bro logic kind of thing, like I've figured it out and I've done it right and I'm not putting feelings into this, but then also God is behind you, and then you become a murderous bastard. And so, that's always the danger. Yeah, I would want to be very, very cautious of owning that kind of name with that kind of power.
Totally fair. Let's see. So, I'm trying to think of other ways that religion has harmed people to kind of give you that extra thing. And it's really difficult to select a particular topic because we only have like 15 minutes left. But obviously you would condemn people like Nick Fuentes, so there's really no reason to rehash that. I mean,
but he's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's trickier. It's trickier because I have a particular relationship to the structure of the church because I'm Catholic. And so for listeners that are unaware, what makes a Catholic, if you look, for example, at a document coming out of Vatican II, what's oftentimes called the kind of Constitution of the Church, a document called Lumen Gentium. It says in that document that the way that we know that we're Catholic is we have visible communion with our bishops, and our bishops have visible communion with the Pope. Like that's what makes the Catholic Church Catholic, is that it's a church made up of churches that all have this kind of affinity for one another that is centered on the Bishop of Rome. Well, that means that I have a particular relationship to my local bishop, and I've got a particular relationship to the Pope. And listeners may be aware that not every pope has been as cool and laid back in many ways as Pope Francis has been. And so, having that kind of relationship with bishops, having that kind of relationship with the Pope can be tricky, because I have an obligation to be a part of this church where I'm in visible communion with them through these relationships, even when I may profoundly disagree with what a particular bishop is saying. Like, there are some bishops that have said stuff that is not quite shy of what Nick Fuentes has said. Like, there are some really bigoted bishops out there, and that's a point of incredible wrestling for me, and deep prayer for me, because I'm very lucky in the Archdiocese of Chicago that I have a bishop, Cardinal Supich, who is much more in line with Pope Francis. But if I were to be in a different geography, I'd have a real problem ahead of me, because I have to in some way be in relationship with these people. I even have to be in relationship to Nick Fuentes. He's not been excommunicated. He's still a Catholic. I don't get to cast him out into the darkness just because I don't like what he says. I have to wrestle and negotiate with the fact that he's part of my church, and I have to own him. And I have to the extent I can, make amends for what he's doing. I can't pretend that he's not part of what constitutes me. So I find it to be an incredibly complex relationship and negotiation, and one that I take very seriously. And I don't, one where I don't think that there are oftentimes simple answers of like identity that I can just turn to and say, well, I'm a good Catholic and that guy's a bad Catholic, or something like that.
So going with what you said about not calling yourself a Christian, because that can become dangerous quickly. Damn it, I lost that too. My brain, man. I'm fried. Yeah, going with not calling yourself a good Catholic or or a Christian, because that can become a slippery slope. What advice would you give to the people who wear that badge of Christianity and go out into the world and behave like we're Christian, so we're better than you? What advice would you give to these people?
Well, I go back to the passage of scripture that you mentioned, the latter part of Matthew chapter 25. And if you take it seriously, that the one place that Jesus promised that Jesus would be showing up on a regular basis would be in the people that our society says least belong, and in the people that our society says are most easily cast out. So Matthew 25 mentions the prisoner and the sick person and the widow and the stranger, the immigrant. But we can extend that, and we can say, that also means the drag queen, the transgender person, the LGBTQ person, the Muslim, you can think about anybody that institutionally we're leaving out. And that's where Jesus has promised to show up. And so if you're not in relationship with these people, and if you're not working for the active flourishing of these people, then you're shielding yourself away from Jesus. And that can be a really awful position to put yourself in, where you're claiming to follow someone that you're refusing to meet in the street. And so I would just start there. And it's not limited to Matthew 25. You can go to Isaiah 53, the suffering servant song, where we are saved by the one that literally was condemned by all. Or you can go to any of the prophets, and you can see this similar dynamic working, where it's like, you're not engaging with God if you simply give your sacrifices. You can't just do that and leave off the weightier matters of justice and mercy and the law. So in any of these sorts of moments, if we go to scripture, if we go to the teachings of the church, if you're Catholic, or if you go to the teachings of other denominations, if you're in the wider sort of realm of Christianity beyond Catholicism, you're going to find that there's, again and again, this call to humility, this call to acceptance, this call to hospitality, and this call to kind of bringing people back who have been on the margins. Pope Francis says that the margins are actually the center of the church, but institutionally we continually get that wrong. So, I mean, those would just be sort of the initial parts of a conversation I'd have with somebody. We'd sit down with scripture together, and I'd say, what do you make of this passage when Jesus says that he's going to show up in the black trans woman? And I do this on Twitter all the time. I say Jesus is a black trans woman, and I get into conversations with people that insist that I've just blasphemed against Jesus Christ. And I pull them back to Matthew 25, and I say, how do you read this passage and not think that way? How do you read this passage and think that you get to exclude these people and treat these people badly? But again, I want to say to your listeners and to you that there's going to be a lot of Catholics who are going to think that what I just said is awful. There's going to be a lot of Christians who think that what I just said is awful. And it's my job as a person who claims this identity, who participates in this community, to hang in and to try and convince them. And the more that I can distract them within the community, the less that they turn outwards and start bashing the vulnerable. And so if I can be a punching bag for them, I'd much rather have that be the case than have them turn that fury on someone who maybe is less equipped to endure it. So that would just be a kind of a beginning. I hope that that's helpful. That's
very helpful, actually. It's honestly, I forgot that Matthew 25 existed for the longest time, but that there are some points where my brain's just like, yeah, and I got it. So I have one more curiosity, and I think that'll be about all the time we'll have for. How familiar are you with Matthew 6 verses 5 through 8?
You're going to have to remind me. I think I know what you're going for, but let me.
Okay, so I googled the verse because ironically it's one of my favorites. I don't know how many people expected an atheist to have a favorite Bible verse, but
I think it's wonderful.
This is my second favorite. My first favorite is it actually comes at the end of very popular wedding vows, and it's when I was a child, I thought like a child, I behaved like a child, but when I grew up, I put aside childish things. That's my personal favorite, but it's because I can kind of twist it a little bit with irony. But my second favorite, Matthew 6 5 through 8. Jesus taught, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. So bearing this verse in mind, well, first of all, what were your thoughts on people who like always stood on the street corners and shouted into a bullhorn, was wearing like those sandwich boards? Around my town, we've got this guy that holds up a sign saying Jesus is Lord or fear the coming wrath of God. What would you say to them bearing that verse in mind?
So we've got a guy like that down in downtown Chicago who stands outside the Target store, and he has a little microphone and battery operated amplifier. And as people are walking by smoking, he's telling folks that smokers are going to hell, and your dress is too short. So I know exactly the kind of folks that you're talking about. I find them funny. I know that you find them funny, and we can kind of make a joke out of them. However, I also need to own that as a member for a long time of the Religious Society of Friends, there is a strand of the history of the Quakers that involves that kind of public testimony. Speaking truth to power is what they call it. And so I would say that my relationship to that is complex, because when you do stand and you are in a state of kind of righteous witness where you are speaking on behalf of the vulnerable, or you're speaking on behalf or speaking out of the spirit for the advocacy against injustice, you're going to look pretty foolish to some people. I mean, there's that part of the book of Amos where the priest comes to Amos and says, look, you're just embarrassing yourself. Why don't you go away, prophet? And Amos responds and says, I'm not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet. I'm a tender of sycamores and a gatherer of figs. And then goes on to basically, dress down this priest who is thinking about appearances rather than thinking about the care for the poor. So I mean, it's a balancing act, because I do think that there's a place for foolishly but convictedly standing up on behalf of the vulnerable. I do think that there's a place where you basically have to put yourself and your reputation on the line for the sake of the least of these, to use that language that we've been drawing from Matthew. But I also think that there's a way that righteousness can easily flip over and become self-righteousness. And I think that's what the Matthew passage that you're talking about here is talking about, where people are praying publicly in order to look kind of more pious, so that they won't actually have to have their actions towards the poor be judged. Well, I'm praying so loud, so don't look at me. I'm a good believer, yada yada. Where really, as the book of James would say, those prayers are meaningless if the poor still are unfed. And so, I mean, that's I think the dynamic that we're working on here. We have a lot of people that are very interested in self-righteous piety and are not actually interested in the righteous proclamation against the powerful. Sorry, I was raised, around Baptists, and so sometimes I get alliterative with this kind of, using the P's and B's. But that would be my response. Is I think that there's a place for being foolish, but that place is in the breach between the poor and the vulnerable and those who would harm them. And in that space, a guy like me is going to look very foolish, because every interest that I have is for me to stay comfortable and to stay safe. But it's my job as a person who wants to honor Christ to jump into that gap and say, I'll take the blows first, I'll take the abuse first, and these people who are more vulnerable are going to be protected as long as I can do that. And that's the best answer I got.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with your assessment of the intention of the verse. And actually, when I was Catholic, that was, I think, my favorite verse. So when I agree that, the intention obviously is for the self-righteous, look at how pious I am, those jagoffs. I couldn't stand them when I was a Catholic. I had like no tolerance for them, and I'm pretty sure. I think that I was just having a bad day on this particular day, but I saw one of these self-righteous types on the corner, and I'm like, look, you are being a massive asshole. You're obviously just doing this for attention. You need to stop, because what you're doing is ultimately pointless. You're just trying to look good for your own self.
And or they should go and do that in a board of directors meeting at a corporation. They shouldn't be doing it on a street corner where people are just trying to live their lives. Like, actually go to the places where the abuse can be named. Okay, then yeah. But yeah, just harassing people on a street corner because you don't like the halter top that they're wearing, that's a very different can of worms.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be really great if there were more people that were on, like, religious people on the street saying, we need to feed the poor. Let's improve the social safety net. Let's lower costs. It's not the most expensive thing on the planet to produce food, but we are about out of time, and I like to end the way I start, by letting you talk about you a little bit. So once more, remind everybody who you are, where you can be found, etc.
So again, I'm David Dault, and I teach at Loyola University Chicago's Institute of Pastoral Studies. So you can find out more about that work at luc.edu/IPS. But my other life is I'm a religious media person, so I work with a number of different podcasts. The ones where I'm directly involved as on-air talent would be thingsnotseenradio.com and francisfxpod.com. So the Francis Effect and Things Not Seen. I really enjoyed this conversation, BMillzebub, and I hope that I get a chance to come back. I would love to continue and to deepen this conversation because we've just begun to scratch the surface. I'm really grateful to you for giving me a space to think out loud with you, and I appreciate very much what you're doing here. Even though you and I might disagree about some of the particulars, about the metaphysics of it, I think that you're coming from a place of deep moral seriousness, and I want to salute that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I definitely would like to have you on for an apostate interview, and I promise I won't be half an hour late this time. Sorry again about that.
It's all
It's
good.
just one of those things. But yeah, I'm gonna let you go. I have to stop my dog from attacking a cat anyway. Thank you again for coming on and discussing your position. I like here. Stop. I like to have discussions with honest people, and from conversation one, you struck me that way. So I
Well, thank you
appreciate
again,
it.
and happy to come back anytime. And best wishes with the Christmas tree. I'm glad that you got it. I hope that it is
Yeah,
a delight for you and your family.
yeah. The inside of my car smells like what is it? White spruce.
That's what my friends call one of them good problems. So
I know, right? It used to just smell like whatever food I picked up from DoorDash. So now I'll be less hungry, at least. All right. Well, that's been the show, everybody. Thanks for stopping by. And again, thank you, David Dault, for coming on.
my
So
pleasure.
until
Thanks again.
next time, everybody, take it easy, and we'll see you in the next one.